Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being patient and waiting. I apologize for being so late. I'm just going to go ahead and jump into it so that we can try to get through as much as we can in the time that we do have. For those of you who don't know me, Yaat Ebene, Hihani Washte, Niampetu Washte for some folks who are it's afternoon time. My name is Tomas Lopez Jr. My mother is waterwoman Sharon Dominguez, and my father is Sundance Chief Tomas Lopez Sr. And I am one of many grandchildren of Chief of Chiefs Leonard Crow Dog. Today, I am going to be doing a workshop on centering Indigenous leadership, not only within the climate movement, but also beyond. We had originally created this toolkit to help young climate activists ensure that they are creating right relations with the Indigenous communities that are relative to where they're at, and ensuring that, we're going beyond just land acknowledgements and actually including Indigenous folks in authentic ways. And so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start a slideshow, and hopefully I can get through this relatively quickly. And again, thank you all for your patience. So again, my name is Tomas Lopez. I'm a member of the International Indigenous Youth Council. I am also a part of Future Coalition, coordinating partnerships for the climate strikes. So that, like I said, the focus of this toolkit, it'll be a resource for non-Indigenous folks to use when organizing with Indigenous folks. And as we've seen, it's going to be crucial in all of our movements, no matter what we're doing, that we are centering these people and reaching out to them in ways that we haven't in the past. We're also going to remember that right now we're focusing specifically on folks here in the Western Hemisphere. A lot of these things do apply to the global South and to a lot of Indigenous communities around the world, but a lot of the stuff that I refer to in this specific segment is specific to Western Hemisphere folks. And also educate folks on language and the ways in which it has effects on our relationships, and also highlighting the importance of moving beyond representation and offering authentic leadership positions and roles to these folks. So the first thing we're going to talk about is language and terminology. So it's important to be really considerate about using past tense language. A lot of the times when folks do land acknowledgement, they will refer to these folks in the past tense as if Indigenous folks are a thing of the past, or were relics that have gone extinct, when in all reality we're very much still here. It's important that we use the names that each tribe chooses to identify as. And oftentimes, as we've found, like a lot of the words that are used to identify Indigenous tribes or peoples were not the names that the people themselves call themselves. And so rather it's a name that's been placed upon them by colonizers. And so it's important that we do this to avoid romanticizing Indigenous people and our practices. And it's really easy for folks to, when you use language in the past tense, to then, I guess, glorify it as if it's more of a fairy tale than actually a social justice issue that is happening in real time and is not only affecting Indigenous folks, but is affecting people across the board. And it's also important that we are engaging in meaningful dialogue with Indigenous tribes and with Indigenous communities. And the first step is understanding and getting awareness around the language that is oftentimes very problematic. And a lot of the times this language is language that we use on a daily basis. Even me growing up, a lot of the times the word Indian was was used to describe us. We would use the term Indian to describe ourselves a lot. And, growing up, it never really, I never understood that because we're not from India, and India has an entire, set of cultures, and it's important to, I don't want to steal that because I'm not Indian. And so, understanding that using even the term Native American, Indigenous people predate America. We go beyond just, our history goes much deeper than Christopher Columbus coming to this country. We've been here for thousands of years, and really understanding that even the Western culture that we see and know today is a very infant culture in comparison to a lot of the tribal cultures and peoples that are in places like America and Africa. And so I just wanted to, it's important that when we are researching folks that are in our Indigenous communities, that we're also understanding what language is going to be appropriate in reaching out to these people. The next thing that's really important about reaching out to Indigenous people is knowing your history. Like I just said, doing research on the relations between, the Western government and the Western constructs and Indigenous tribes is really important, because oftentimes there is a history of trauma and a history of pain there that must be talked about. It must be identified. And a lot of the times those, these very horrific things were done to Indigenous people on behalf of the US government, and no reparations or no, acknowledgement even of these horrific things has been done. And so it's important that we know our history, not only the history that's been presented like for me, I went to public school and I received a very different history in history class than I did when I was actually at home being given the history when I was home. So the first thing is to really take ownership in actively seeking education, conversations, and resources to help you gain deeper understanding of Indigenous people and culture. So you can seek online resources, but like I said, you have to remember that a lot of the stuff that we find online and a lot of the stuff that we read in history books has been written by non-Indigenous folks. And that sometimes doesn't quite give you the full idea and picture of who these folks are. And so sometimes you can seek guidance from Indigenous people. But when we do seek guidance from Indigenous people on these things, it's important to be aware of their capacity to actually educate you. We have to remember that folks can say no. They can look at you and say, I don't feel comfortable, telling you the history because maybe I don't know it well enough. Or, maybe there is protocol in which they can tell you stories. For some tribes, it's really could be dependent on the season. A lot of folks don't tell their creation stories or any stories during the winter or during the summer. They only tell these stories during the winter. And so you have to remember like what these folks' capacity is. And so getting that consent from folks before you expect them to educate you is very important as well, and asking them if they have the capacity to educate you or to share their stories or share their knowledge. And the other thing is we encourage everybody to just consider making land acknowledgements a regular part of your activist work. And like I tell people, it doesn't always have to be an Indigenous person doing the land acknowledgement. We can other people can acknowledge the peoples whose land we're standing on. And it's important that when we're inviting people, that we're not just asking them to give land acknowledgements, right? That we're asking them to show up in the way that they feel most empowered, to show up in the way that they see as most appropriate for not only them but also their people. You know, some people may not even want to participate. They may just really appreciate the invitation and they may just want to show up, while others may be say, yes, we want to open with a prayer and we want to close with a prayer. That's how we want to offer. And others may choose to just speak, you know, and give a speech or give some type of representation or leadership of on behalf of Indigenous people. And that's going to vary person to person, tribe to tribe. And so for those of you who do not, for those of you who don't know whose land you're standing on, we do use this resource, which is a native land map. And the link to this is native-land.ca. And if you go to this map, you can click go to map, and what it actually does is it gives you, you can go ahead and you can search where you're at. So if you are in Los Angeles, California, you can go ahead and type that in and it'll auto populate and go ahead and zoom into the specific area that you chose. And then once you do that, you can see that this, according to this, it was the land of the Tongva, the Kis, and the Chumash. And it kind of breaks up where their land was and the different territories that were there, the languages that were spoken, and any treaties that might define what that land is today. And so I just want to share that resource with everybody. Again, that's native-land.ca. And so let me go big again. So that's one way that you can know your history. So the other thing that we want to talk about is outreach and relationship building. So it's important that when we are reaching out to Indigenous tribes that we're identifying leadership, that we're asking ourselves, does the tribe follow hereditary or tribal government leadership? Does the tribe have a history of social or climate resistance? Are they matrilineal or patrilineal? Is there a youth group that might be leading actions or community events? And if there is there some type of protocol to reach out to those youth? Oftentimes we want to go through elders before we just go to the youth and ensure that, you know, these young people are being looked after and that their best, the best intentions are being sought for them. This is important for not only creating the relationship, but also maintaining the relationship with Indigenous folks. And it's important to approach Indigenous communities before even starting the planning process and authentically asking Indigenous people and communities and organizers to the table so that they can help organize and decide the ways in which Indigenous folks can be involved, and like really let them authentically decide what that space will look like for them. And then also remembering that different tribes have different ways to respectfully ask for help. You know, some people may want you to go to the tribal government, and some people may have a line of clan mothers that you have to get permission from. And so finding out what the respectful way to do that is going to look different tribe to tribe. So that's where that land map will really come in handy in telling you which tribes are where. So the next thing that we want to talk about is just remembering that there's a difference between leadership and representation. So what is representation? Representation is really needed for power, for the power that it has the ability to give an audience a multitude of identities and experiences to relate to. Representation has the potential to feel empowered. Now, what is leadership? Leadership is an act of empowerment that representation holds the potential for. So leadership puts trust into the knowledge that we carry by giving us room to shape the meaning of this movement. And it's important also that we are moving beyond just prayer. You know, Indigenous folks, we understand that we have a very strong spiritual identity. And we understand that there are many things that we can offer in terms of that identity. But sometimes when all we're doing is being asked to come and pray for folks, when all we're doing is being asked to come and to um, carry a spiritual burden for people, it begins to become just more tokenizing and exhausting, more than anything. And so it's important that, like I said, that we're bringing people to the table before we even begin the planning process, that we are making sure that Indigenous folks are being authentically involved in what we're doing, and that we're not reaching out to them, the week before, to ask them to open up with a prayer and to acknowledge the land, that they really know what's going on, and they can decide in what way they can show up, and again decide what that space ultimately looks like, and ensure that it is a safe that is space for that is safe for Indigenous people. So ways that you can consider moving beyond prayer is when you're asking Indigenous people to lead a ceremony or land acknowledgement. What are you hoping to bring with us? Are you hoping that we bring feathers or other items that might, to you, indicate our level of indigeneity? A lot of the times, a lot of natives don't have feathers. A lot of natives don't own a lot of, spiritual items, and it doesn't make them any less Indigenous. It doesn't make them, it doesn't make those who have them any more Indigenous. And so it's important that, we're also asking folks that don't maybe fit what we see as the Indigenous gaze, to come and represent be in leadership positions, as well. And so remembering that, we just want people to show up as themselves in their power, and in that power they also reclaim that power. So also remembering, what ideas and opinions does this person have that I really appreciate, or that I want to make room for? So not only are we asking you to come and pray, but we want to hear from you. We want to know what this person's story is. Every Indigenous person has a story, and each one of our stories is immensely different from the next. And really honoring those different stories and honoring that trauma is what we want to do right now more than anything. And when we give and we invite and we organize with Indigenous people in an authentic manner, that's what we're doing, is we're honoring those different ideas and opinions and stories that this person may have. So the other thing is, don't ever, assign us a role completely. Make sure that the Indigenous folks are comfortable with fulfilling whatever role that you might be suggesting. Make sure that you ask us if we would like to do, or which way that we can actually step in. This is something that can also be a problem with, urban and rural Indigenous folks. And it's a problem that we navigate through as well, ensuring that, not everybody has the same type of skill set, and not everybody is on the same level in the different skill sets that we have. So we have to really be patient and cognizant and gentle with that. And that's definitely something I know I struggle with. And so, just remembering that we can always be working on that. And then also, are you only interested in Indigenous people leading things that are specific to us? Or are you giving us positions where we can lead on a more broad aspect? So including folks in messaging and demands, and making sure that we're there for all of that to authentically, again, be a part of things in the way in which we feel is most safe. And again, like I talked about, there's a really big difference in understanding that when you're working with rural and urban communities. So there are many different histories that folks have, and a lot of that, really remembering that there are Indigenous people all over the world. We are in rural communities, on reservations, on reserves. We're in South America, we are in major cities, New York, LA, Denver. We are everywhere, and we have different stories, as I said. And, when we're organizing with Indigenous people, we have to also remember, urban Indigenous folks and rural Indigenous folks are going to operate much different. neither is right and neither is wrong. They're both Indigenous, and they're both just as valid in what they're saying and what they're demanding. And so when we organize with these communities, it's important that we understand the history of dislocation and relocation. Most major cities have a foundation of dislocation or relocation of Indigenous people. Understanding what the doctrine of discovery is and manifest destiny, and the way in which white settlers obtained and stole land from Indigenous people, while ultimately being praised and sanctioned on behalf of the Catholic and Christian Church, is really important. And really, what the doctrine of discovery said was that God gave one set of people the right to basically do what they wanted onto another set of non-human people, and basically sanctioned the genocide of Indigenous folks. And that really set the basis for a lot of the major cities and states that exist today, and why the tribal governments and why the state and local governments have such rocky relationships with the Indigenous communities that might live in, near, around, or surrounding them. And so when we're talking about what our relationship is with different communities, we have to understand how, in what way was their land taken from them, and also in what ways did some of these folks eventually lose their tribal recognition. And so the next thing that I encourage people to begin to research is the Indian Relocation Act of 1956, otherwise known as Public Law 959. What this did was what I like to say is we were tricked yet again by the US government. Indigenous people were offered a small sum of money and education opportunities if they gave up their tribal recognition. And they moved into major cities. A lot of these cities included Denver and Los Angeles, and a lot of the major cities in the US where you see large pockets of urban Indigenous people. And what this did was eventually allow the US government to also say that a lot of these tribes were no longer eligible for tribal recognition. So what we do is, it's important to remember that some Indigenous tribes go by blood quantum, and some tribes go strictly on what Lakota people, and I don't know what the word is for every Indigenous tribe, but is called Hunkapi. And it's basically that, the people choose who their people are. And so blood quantum, though, is the process in which we basically track the amount of native a person has in their blood. And so if your mother and father, if your mother was a Lakota woman and your father was an American Italian man, and they had you, then you were half Lakota. And then if you married, say you married a Mexican man, then your child would be then 1/4 Lakota. And so the only other species that use this form of measurement in terms of like blood and blood quantum are dogs and horses. And ultimately what it's used for is to breed something out. And so they used this to basically say that the native in certain tribes had been bred out, and this ultimately came from the ideology of kill the Indian and save the man. And so they figured, well, these people no longer have enough native in them to legally claim this land as their own. Therefore, the state can then step in and take it for their own. And this happened to people I mean, it happened to people, indigenous tribes across the United States, and most recently happened to the Mashpee people, who were some of the first people who are celebrated on Thanksgiving as the people who, you know, saved the Pilgrims. And so it's a really, really messed up way of colonizing land and stealing land from indigenous people. And so that is one of the really big reasons why a lot of indigenous people may actually not have tribal recognition, or they may not have tribal cards. And it's something that varies person to person and identity to identity. And that is what ultimately creates this reservation versus or like rural versus urban identity. And I actually don't like the way I put it in here, you know, versus really I meant to say and, because they're not against each other, and we should never be. And it's important that we include both of these voices, because they're both so different, but they're one and the same. And explaining that to people is a part of explaining the identity, and a part of humanizing us, and really understanding the diversity within Indigenous communities. So I just want to talk a little bit about COVID-19 and some of